Oh, good morning. Welcome to week 5. I think I will get things started off with a poem called American Children by Jim Simmerman. Jim Simmerman was a longtime teacher and poet in the Southwest, a friend of mine who passed away a few years ago. And this was from his book called American Children. And I figured it was appropriate to start with, as you all are working on your second writing assignment where you're responding to a work of visual art. This book, in fact, is what Simmerman did, and I knew a little bit of the story about how he got things going with this book, just having known him. So, and having those kind of conversations about how writers get started with interesting projects, or at least projects that have caught their attention. He was in New York at a museum, and there was a collection called American Children, and he ended up a lot of those photos really struck him. And that's what drove this last book of his. So I'll give it a read. It's a little bit longer. I'll have the electronic copy available in the module if you want to look at all the particular lines. But I think the main thing is he hops around from metaphor to metaphor, simile to simile, kind of odd, quirky detail, and he is clearly responding to a photo, but he lets it go a bit. He lets it run a little bit wild and lets his imagination take over as need be. American Children. This time, when it comes all the way, like a fist to the throat, only harder. Only this time it comes from inside, the way a plane explodes, and what it takes to step from puzzle piece to piece of wreckage still smoldering on the lake's calm face. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know because I'm not in the picture of the cab and the cop and the rubbernecks with their hands pressed together like cheap sandwiches or slung from their pockets like birds. Sometimes they and look away, but the problem is they have to look at something, and so they look at me. They think they are looking through the window, but because it has rained, the window is streaked, and all they see, probably, and a little blurry, is themselves. Which is all they are, really. Even in a photograph, stalled at the intersection of America and time, where these things happen, as we say, when there's nothing to be done. And what I fail to notice is the chalk outline on the asphalt, so faint already it looks like a wind. If a wind can live in a photograph, might erase it. Even to mention it is a violation to which I am prepared to plead guilty on the day of judgment assigned me. Until then, I am sentenced to witness what Louis Ferrer sentenced to the foreground in black and white, untitled in 1949. A boy in a striped t-shirt. He's so skinny, he wears his arms like a straitjacket. How cold he must be. Each tooth drilled into a lip like an ice age. His eyes are BBs. I don't know what to say. And that is the problem of this poem, which is not, in fact, about a photograph, but about a woman outside my office, weeping in the hall. She is not engaged by photography or art or the leisure class of language at the moment. She has lost a child, that's all. And although it has been almost a year, there's no consoling her now. Time has broken. This is not mine to claim. What can be written has been written already on a Kleenex I gave her. Let the wind blow it away. That's Simmerman, American Children. I find that just to be an absolutely powerful poem. Of course, we have the picture that he's referring to from 1949, but he also, as the writer, as the poet, he's willing to let go of that picture and introduce the present, right, where he's in his office, and outside in the hallway there's a woman still weeping. The act is he offers a Kleenex, and you can assume sort of off stage, as it were, outside the poem, that maybe they even had a conversation and he got some of that background information perhaps, or maybe it's just imagination. Maybe he's also guessing at the background information. Either one of these things are fair, right? It's hard to say exactly, but that's what's driving that. He's moving from that photo. He even talks a little bit about writing the photo, that sort of metapoetic part where he's talking, where he mentions a poem directly. And then he bounces into that present moment as well. So he's willing to move from photo, move away, come back as need be. I think that's something that's pretty interesting. One of the things I do have is I have this copy of that Museum of Modern Art that he went to, he picked up, there was an exhibition called American Children, and then he picked up a book that had a bunch of photos of it. So this is that book right there. This is my high-tech editing right in there. So you get sort of an idea. They're sort of mid-20th century photos. And I thought they were just absolute blast. I'm going to stick some right on the camera. Again, that's my version of doing PowerPoint. So something like that. Kids like this. These sort of things here. But it's got it's a whole selection there. In fact, he ended up titling, I'm going to do this one more time. This is his American Children, the book. And he went with this image, which I think is a fun image. But that's not what he originally had in mind. That was the editor's decision over at BOA. What he was hoping for was something more like, a photo like this, where they ran across problems securing copyright permissions. I think it was just too expensive, or the photographer just didn't want to allow use of that image. So they had to go with Plan B. But I think that it's an absolutely terrific poem, and the other poems that are in here in American Children, they're not all directly based on photos, but they all have that sort of energy and that sense of whatever it was that got him going at that museum. They all have that sense to it. So a lot of it he's reflecting on his own personal memories, childhood. There's a great long poem in there called Levis, after the poet Larry Levis, that we might talk about a little bit towards the end of the semester if things shake out that way. Levis was a teacher of Simmerman's and had that same sort of imagistic, wide, visionary type of writing. So fun stuff in there. Something to get us thinking about, getting us out of our regular routines and moving on to more of a poetic way of thinking about things, more of a way a writer might observe and think things. So, so let me kind of go through my notes and see if there's anything else I wanted to add on there. I think the main thing I was hoping for is to get just a little bit of energy and a little bit of. I'm hoping you're enjoying putting the second assignment together and have picked out what you want to work with, as far as that you've had a chance to find an online gallery and browse through that, and hopefully have found at this point you found what you're going to be working with or responding to. That would be great, and then are in that process of getting that first draft down and then shaping it and working it from there. So I'm hoping that Simmerman piece gets you at least some ideas, some of the possibilities. Have fun with it. Okay. Let's see. The other one I want to read. Usually I start with one, but I'm going to go with two today. Is one by Rilke. Rainer Maria Rilke, who was a German writer, born in Austria at the end of the 19th century, and absolutely amazing poet. I thoroughly enjoy his work, and he was oftentimes described as one of the how they put it, one of the most intense poets that write about feelings. And I think, well, that's kind of a big claim. I think some critic early on in his writing career made that claim, and then it stuck in all the other reviews. But that was one of the things that was striking to me, as he was considered to be the poet the most feeling in the 20th century. That's kind of a big claim, but it is something that's typically associated with Rilke, and I think that he has an absolutely fascinating life. He was the secretary to Rodin in Paris in the early, I think it was like about 1906, for about 6 years. Starting about 1906, he was a secretary to Rodin. Rodin at that time was one of the most famous sculptors in the world. And if you're familiar with his sculpture, The Thinker, it's the one where the guy is going like this. And I sort of know that from Bugs Bunny cartoons when I was a kid. There was always they'd always do some sort of version where they're puzzling or thinking like that. I'll show an image in the module as well towards the end there. But Rodin was this phenomenal sculptor at the time, and Rilke had the good fortune of being his secretary. So he spent several years there, and as I mentioned, he's from Austria, so his first language is German, and that's what he mostly writes in. Although he ended up at that time when he was in Paris, it was another language for him, but he certainly was fluent in French, and he wrote hundreds and hundreds of poems in French. And what possessed him to do so was that he's a young, ambitious person, and has access as Rodin's secretary to talk to him at any given time, and so wanted to get his advice not just on things on the arts but on his own writing. So the story goes that Rilke brought some poems to Rodin and asked him what he thought, and Rodin sort of read through these things, and I'm not sure how long he considered them, but considered them for some time, and then he said to Rilke, the main problem with these poems is that you just can't see. Just sort of left it at that. You can't see. You need to work on your vision, and then your poems will be better. So that was his advice. Rilke was not discouraged by that. In fact, what he did was he spent those next 5 or 6 years writing hundreds and hundreds of poems in French, trying to describe movement. He has some poems that are famous, or later went on to be famous, about a panther and other things that move. And he's at the zoo there in Paris, and he's watching this panther, and apparently just spends all sorts of time observing this animal in its cage and in its habitat, and is just writing these poems that turn out to be brilliant poems. But he spends hundreds and hundreds of poems writing probably what weren't great descriptions, and working on this idea of how to see things and how to see movement, and taking it seriously. I'm sure he had all these drafts that probably went nowhere. So that story was one of those ones that became famous after he'd become famous. At this time, that's early in his career. Barely has anything to call a career at all. And so he's done some of this writing. And then he doesn't do much for a decade plus. There is the main thing that gets in his way, of course. World War I breaks out, the first World War, and he's conscripted. He's drafted into that, survives that, gets through that, and he has he's a family, and he has the business of taking care of his family and raising his kids, that type of thing. And so not a whole lot goes on as far as with his writing. He's known about, and he's doing stuff, but he's not known. And then later on in his life, after he's gotten through World War I, gotten his kids raised up a little bit, there's the impetus for this next batch of writing that he does is it's called the Sonnets to Orpheus, and there's a friend of theirs, sort of a child that's sort of a good friend of his daughter, just dies suddenly as things happen, and there's something about the family as he's trying to talk with his children about this, and he's trying to process this action. There's something that gets him writing again, and he writes in about, I think, something like 50-something sonnets in about 3 weeks. It's just this tremendous outpouring from the sense of grief, loss, whatever it is, and it's and from what I understand, they're mostly intact. Very little revision is actually even done, and there's some of the most brilliant work that he's ever done. And people talk about this kind of overnight success type of thing, but they forget he'd spent time years and years before writing nonstop, trying to figure out how to see, how to observe. So I mentioned that kind of long, rambling story about Rilke, which is to say it's all that unseen work that he's done before, that when there is a point in his life where there's both time, in terms of he's not fighting in a war, and there's also a catalyst to trigger with this grief or this loss that he's wanting to express. So when these things come together, then it looks like overnight success. He's just some sort of genius that spontaneously makes everything up. Like, well, he's a genius, and his spontaneous is better than most anyone else's work, but it's because he did all that work early on. So I'm going to read this poem by Rilke, and I'll do one more of these pictures too, just to kind of give you an idea of what Rodin's sculptor style is. There's all these. This is sort of the things that he ends up doing. Well, shots of sculptures, and they all just have such movement and energy to them. So, yeah, let me I'll read this Rilke poem here. called The Archaic Torso of Apollo. So the thing that has started this poem is that there is there's the ancient Greek sculpture of Apollo, but the head's missing, the limbs are missing, that type of thing. It's just the torso, which is the main thing. So he's responding to that, and you'll quickly hear how fast he leaps away from the subject matter and gets into the energy and trying to see not just what's in front of him, but almost through or into what's in front of his eyes. And also, before I'll do a little stall, because I used to teach this poem quite a bit when I would do workshops down at Cochise College down in southern part of Arizona, way down south on the border there. And a lot of times I set up Rilke's life. I mentioned him a little bit because I'd had folks say, well, they'll read that title, the Archaic Torso of Apollo, and it just sounds like it's just something aloof, something that's not necessarily for them, and that it's some sort of high art or high literature, and therefore a sort of high poetics response to it. I don't think it's anything like that. But I mentioned that as far as where Rilke comes from and his origins, because he does end up in this world of art and describing things in this world of art. But I think he's a pretty practical, common sense sort of person doing so. We have no idea what his fantastic head was like, where the eyeballs were slowly swelling. But his body now is glowing like a gas lamp, whose inner eyes, only turned down a little, hold their flame, shine. If there weren't light, the curve of the breast wouldn't blind you, and the swerve of the thighs, a smile, wouldn't keep on going toward the place where the seeds are. If there weren't light, this stone would look cut off, where it drops clearly from the shoulders. Its skin wouldn't gleam like the fur of a wild animal, and the body wouldn't send out light from every edge as a star does. For there is no place at all that isn't looking at you. You must change your life. Such an odd ending. So I thoroughly enjoyed this poem. I've read through this quite a bit and gone back to this, and it's always got something new for me each time. Yeah, so we'll think about Rilke a little bit, and maybe that might help out a little bit too. I think the main thing is have some fun with it. So once you've selected what you're responding to, keep in mind it's fiction. They're fiction, so you can have characters pop in. So I know, just with going back to Jim Simmerman's first poem that I started out with today, I know that there was a person outside weeping, and he actually looked looked out to see what was going on, see if he could help. So there was a person that was outside his office when he was writing that, and he allowed that to enter the poem. At the same time, you can as the writer, you can imagine, because you'll be writing fiction. It doesn't have to be all literally true. You can imagine that there'd be something like that. You can introduce that person as a character if it allows you to tell that sort of emotional truth, or if it allows you to continue to write a compelling story that gets the idea, the concept, the feeling of what you want done in the story. So yeah. So I'll mention those things, and then I'll move towards some of the other things on our list. What I guess I'll call some of the housekeeping type of issues and whatnot. I wanted to get back to that. Thinking about your first assignment. So I think I mentioned before, a lot of times the way I like to lecture, to talk about writing, is to cover what we've done, concentrate on what we're up to, and then look forward to what we're doing next, and then sort of rotate those three things all together. So I might refer to things that happened a few weeks ago. I might hint at what's going to come up next and bounce those things back and forth. I think it's more the way our brain works. It's the way that we process information, especially as writers. And I know you're all writers now because I've had the chance to read your first papers, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and we're off to a tremendous start. So I want you also to think of yourself, if you didn't already, think of yourself as a writer, and also the same way we'll go back, we'll go forward, and speculate what we're doing. We'll kind of look at the past, and then we'll move these past, present, and future. We'll move these things all back and forth. So that's what I'm thinking anyway. So I wanted to think about that, the first papers that you had, if you're in the process of revising those things. That's why I gave the writing assignment with Pia Earhart to look at her chapter, that relatively short chapter, but I think a really important chapter. And I think one of those things that I'm glad it's a shorter chapter, so hopefully you can go back and read it twice, 3 times, or you can go back and when you're looking at if you're revising that first assignment and thinking about that, might be something you go back to again and use potentially in your final portfolio for this class. Or if you there are also several people that just wanted to keep working on them. I had a few messages that I had some nice sort of electronic conversations anyway, with folks thinking about how can make a little bit of improvements. If I wanted to keep going with this, either send out for publication or either want to pass it along, as far as a couple of folks, or two people were kind of looking at more of the kind of a family history, that type of thing with it. So there were things that folks were wanting to do to keep working with that. And Pierre Earhart, I think, is an excellent example of finding those areas that are your structural, your support sentences that really keep the overall piece interesting, engaging, and bring it to life. So I thought that was a good one. Hopefully that was useful to you. The other thing I would mention, I put in those mini lectures last week, as far as the idea of showing versus telling. That's always a good way of pulling out more of those details. Also mentioned, let's see, in those little mini lectures, we also had the idea of closing with an image that we introduced. We've been talking about titles, especially in our reading. So it's coming up with an interesting title, interesting first hook, which overall those were actually, that was really fantastic with that first group of papers. A lot of interesting titles, a lot of really engaging hooks that drew me in, at least as the reader, right away. And so we talked a little about closing. We talked about scope, what you can cover. So you're not going to cover the same amount of information if you were trying to write a 4-part novel series. Obviously, right, you were going to get the right amount of scope and dial things in. All these things are things that hopefully you're using as a field guide and coming back and revising. They're all things to think about for the second assignment. And so I'll leave that at that. And let me scan through. So I go back and forth between my eyes have in the last year just slightly deteriorated. So I need to kind of go back and forth in my lecture notes here. And I need my glasses from time to time to do it. Some of our other housekeeping. So verbs, that was the other thing that I haven't done a mini lecture yet on verb selection. A few of you may have put on your papers something about verb choice being key. The thing with the verb selection, and I'll do a little longer mini lecture on this thing, but I'm going to kind of just leave it as far as introducing this concept now, and we'll come back and hit it in more detail when we get to more of the revising. If you're going back through in your papers you're writing, after you've already done a first solid draft, you've gotten all the words on the page where you can start working with them, right? Or at least all the words you think you need on the page. One of the things that you can do towards the end is look at those verbs. Look at what's going on there. I had a lot of stories with terrific details, interesting, quirky things going on. One of the things that can happen, though, is if you're using a lot of what they call passive voice verbs, and if you have is, are, those type of verbs, forms the verb be. If you're going through and you're finding are, was, is, those type of more passive verbs that aren't really doing much of anything, right? Go through that and see if you can come up with a better verb. A lot of times what will happen is you'll end up, when you're fiddling with those verbs, again, as a revising, proofing exercise, is that verb is just a placeholder. Right? So it's not doing a whole lot. So if you write the desk is the desk is messy, something like that, right? The is isn't doing much there. Desk equals messy. That's about all it's doing in there. But if you can make it more active, right, and you can have pens, papers, broken stapler, and crumpled paper clutter the desktop. Right? So clutter becomes the verb right there. So all these things now have all these particular details that you listed. Clutter, right, the verb is doing something that's active. And the clutter what the desktop. All right, so it's just a way of switching things around. It'll also rearrange the way your sentences are constructed a little bit in a way that you don't have to think about it from like a grammatical textbook point of view, or like the Strunk and White Elements of Style or something like, a style guide. If you just concentrate on the verbs and make them look interesting, then you don't have to start thinking about, is that a comma splice or do I have a modifier, and all these rules of grammar that can sometimes get us bogged down. They're good to know, and you have to know them at some level. They also can get in the way of your creativity and your ability to write. They can really bog you down. It's the way I think about it. If I go through and I start looking at my verbs, and are they interesting? Are they doing much? Does it make sense to have them in there? Then if I start fiddling, making a better verb, I'll start rearrange my sentence a little bit, and a lot of those grammatical questions, they go away. So that's my quick little theory. I'll get into them. I'll keep coming back to verbs. Verbs are the absolute key to terrific and energetic writing. So let's see. I'm going to scroll through some of the other housekeeping type of things. I mentioned before I got the videos of everyone reading, and thoroughly enjoyed those. Those were great, and it was good to see and hear your voices and to apply that with your writing. It was terrific for me to be able to put those two things together and get some, at least in some ways, conversation back and forth with us potentially. And I was going to take those and try to build a little YouTube channel and that type of thing. I'd mentioned that before. I'm going to hold off on that for now. And the only reason is because there's just some technology glitches. A few folks had to turn things in different ways, and we're working with the tech that they had. And I just found myself getting tremendously bogged down trying to get everything working together. We'll have a second opportunity to do that later on in the semester. I'll see if I can smooth some things out before then. It's 2020. We need to sort of adapt. So I had an idea of what I wanted to do with that functionality. It wasn't quite. It would have been a little more cumbersome, certainly as far as from me sorting those things, and then also potentially on the way. I wanted to make it easy for you all to view and not make it a chore, and maybe be something of interest to promote. Something where you don't feel like you're alone, isolated, writing, taking this class, and we're just having a video. That there are other people out there. There's 30 people in the class. So I just thought it'd be a nice way for you all to see them and see some of your other colleagues that are working on similar projects. I'll get that rolling. I'm just not going to deal with this first one, as it turns out. So we'll table that until I can figure out a couple of those little things. And let's see. I mentioned also, as far as paper 2, coming up on September 24th. So 24th, Thursday, that thing is due. As I mentioned, hopefully at this point you've already had a chance to do a little bit of your selecting of material. You've gone to a virtual or electronic gallery and have found something of interest, I hope, and are getting that first draft down. The main thing is get it onto the page where you can work with it, even if you end up if we're going to get down to 500 words, just get the words down to start with, as far as avoid that writer's block. If you have to free write, just write whatever sort of, if you're just describing the image itself, maybe you're just very literally describing the image quite a bit, and it's maybe even if it's going nowhere, let it continue to go nowhere. Keep describing, and then if you find yourself, hopefully there's something that surprises you about this and where this leads you, as with Jim Simmerman's example with that with his response there, and let things happen. You don't have to stick to the this is a fiction piece. You don't have to stick to what is literally happening or something literally on the page. You can let that painting, that picture, whatever the image, you can let that come to life. It's almost, I think it's difficult because there's all sorts of options, right? It's not very strict as far as it's fairly wide open. So let your imagination run with it. Let your kind of sort of that wild association go and see what happens. I mean, that's what we've been. A lot of our reading. That's a common thread of what we've covered so far in the previous 4 or so weeks of the class. So September 24th being the big thing that paper will be due. I don't have any other particular announcements other than I will. One of the comments that I received on a note with the first paper was, did I have a list of when all the assignments were going to be due? I do, and so I've been kind of holding off because just with all the uncertainties of this year, trying to make sure I can fit everything in and wanting to hedge and wait a little bit. If I wait too long, the semester is going to be gone. So I think that I appreciate that note. I will put in our announcements. I'll put all those particular due dates, and just a quick little one sentence description of what those things will be. A more detailed assignment prompt will be coming out as we get closer to that time, but at least you can mark it on your calendars and you can have an idea of what's coming up. I appreciated that suggestion or that question from the student who did that, and also that allowed me. I figured I'd kind of close this lecture for now, thinking about that notion of time management. Very much appreciate that comment or consideration, because that's one of the things that we can do with this class being online. Is that I have basically this similar. I already have my kind of lectures set up, and I can I want to cover them in a certain order that I'm hoping is the optimal order to get you, doing the best writing you can, and the best enjoyment of the reading that you can have with that. So that's the idea of what we're going to be up to. And but I think that also there's the idea of time management becomes key. I can put a lot of the stuff up earlier, and I think I will start getting that up a little bit earlier, so that you can also take a look at what you're going to need to do in this class. We've been going for about a quarter of the semester so far now, and you have an idea hopefully about how long things are taken for you in this class. You can look at your other classes. What's the time situation? If you've got one that's really you're really bogged down with it takes you quite a bit. If you have one that maybe it's relatively easy for you and it doesn't bog you down, but you can start balancing that and see what your schedule looks like. Of course, there's all sorts of commitments that as far as work commitments, family commitments, whatever else you need to take care of. You've hopefully had a chance to see how all these things fit together, and you can start figuring out how you can do your best work in this class also with what's left. So I'll start getting more of that information out to you. Time management is always key. That's the way you get the best stuff done. I know it sounds nice as a writer that I kind of wait for the muses to inspire me or something like that. I've never found that to be the case as a writer. I've always been the way that I've got my best work done is by having a writing deadline and hitting those things. Oftentimes, it's nice if you have an editor or publisher that somehow is giving you an external deadline, or in this case, this class, that I'm putting the deadlines for the assignments on there for you. Whatever it is that drives you, it's nice to have those things, but it's also important too to set them for yourself, to break those pieces apart and see how you're going to get there from there. So thinking about our friend Rilke there, how he managed to write the sonnets of Orpheus in 3 brilliant weeks of inspiration, and of course he was this overnight success is what they were claiming, what the critics were saying, but in hindsight we know that now he spent years working on his craft. He also spent years surviving all sorts of like I said, World War I and on those type of things too. So and also raising his family, taking care of business, in order for him to be an overnight success. All that stuff is time management, right? It's not waiting for the muse to come in and magically deliver the writing to you. So with any of this, I would encourage you to make sure to get your reading done early. Think about these things. Hopefully that way it's enjoyable. Take your notes in your journal. Constantly take in your writing notes in your journal, so you have something to go to and you have something to kick around, and those little prompts to get your working on an idea or concept. And then you can have fun with it, right? Then enjoy. So that's all the stuff I have for this week, and I'll also be putting as far as what we covered here with Rilke and Simmerman. I'll put those poems in the module, as well as some of those other images for you to think about, and that will take us away. I won't have a particular reading assignment from Flash Fiction for this week. I've got kind of the next point. We're going to be with the second assignment. That'll be your second Flash Fiction assignment, and then we'll be switching to creative nonfiction. So we're going to be kind of changing gears a little bit in the class. We have three big shifts as far as we'll do the fiction, which we've been doing, nonfiction, and then we'll do poetry. But of course, we're always doing the 1, 2, 3 circle, right? So I might, even if we're in poetry, I'll refer back to the fiction we've been doing. Even while we're in fiction as we are now, I'll be setting you up for the poetry in the last part of the semester. So that's the idea anyway. But thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing your next assignment.